I want to welcome everyone here today to our webinar on collaborating with faculty on designing a course with adaptive courseware, with a focus on the instructional design perspective. And I'm Susan Adams. I'm the Associate Director of Teaching and Learning at Achieving the Dream. And I have my colleague, Eric Fierro here, who's supporting us on the back end with some tech support and monitoring the chat for us. Thank you so much, Eric. And I'll introduce Kevin and Sarah, if you want to take your mic off and introduce yourselves.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Kevin Dranuski, and I am a senior instructional designer at Cuyahoga Community College, located in Cleveland, Ohio.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sarah Goode, and I'm an instructional technologist at Cuyahoga Community College, and actually in the office right next door to Kevin.
Great. Both of them will get a chance to kind of share how the instructional design is organized at their institution, because I think that'll also be of interest in how their different roles and different titles play out in their work. So I want to give a little context for the support of this initiative and this project on bringing adaptive courseware to different institutions. The Every Learner, Everywhere network has a mission, right, to bring together, and it started off with 12 partner organizations, providing comprehensive and coordinated approach to infiltrating, I almost like to say, or implementing adaptive courseware into both four-year institutions and two-year institutions. And the focus was on first-year foundational courses, or what we also say as gateway courses, that really were identifying the success rates for students to get through those courses and how can we support that. Recognizing that foundational courses typically have first-year introductory, credit-bearing, continue to have low completion rates. So how can we mitigate that? And this was an initiative to try to do that. So we're excited to report that there have been some great successes and also some great learnings about what it looked like to bring adaptive courseware into a course. And we want to spend time today really thinking about how can we guide educators in evaluating how this new technology can optimize their instructional approaches by ensuring that the course content is aligned with what's happening in the adaptive learning courseware and the experience. So we're going to define that for you as well, but also understanding how to analyze the learning analytics data points to inform teaching. And we as instructional designers can be at the front lines of consulting with faculty to help them meaning make around that learning analytics data and what's possible. We also want to talk to you. Many of you have already experienced adaptive courseware. Some of you are new to it. So we want this to be a conversational webinar to be able to garner kind of your experiences as well. We're also going to identify student onboarding strategies, which is something we always want to make sure happens, and often instructional designers are the ones that kind of amplify that need, and also engage with new consultation strategies for collaborating with faculty. So how can we do this well, both whether it's a group training or even an individual one-on-one? So we want to get a little sense of who's in the room. So we're going to do a quick little poll on how familiar are you with adaptive learning courseware? So take a moment to fill that out.
Okay, we'll give it a couple more seconds here. And it looks like we're almost evenly split between we're kind of familiar or we're unfamiliar with it. So this is going to be a great opportunity to take a look at adaptive courseware and how that can be implemented into the faculty and student experience. So I'm going to turn it over to Kevin, and he's going to lead off and just give us a little bit of a background on what adaptive courseware is.
Sure. Thanks, Sarah. I'm happy to see these results because this is where I was not too long ago, where, I've heard of adaptive courseware, but I've really never dug deep and worked with faculty regarding it until, we were approached to work on this grant program, and we had a lot of success. So the overall urgent question here is what is adaptive courseware? And the current promise of adaptive learning systems is not to just personalize the instruction, but also to give students kind of agency over their own learning, and also faculty the space to effectively meet students where they are in regards to the course content and the curriculum. So if you look at this graphic that we have right here, this is kind of just a scenario of what a class might look like of a sample of 3 students who are using this adaptive courseware. And what the diagram is showing is each student moves through the course kind of on their own customized path. And it's based on data points and analytics of their current knowledge, their pre-test knowledge, and how they perform throughout the semester. So in an adaptive learning system, these are online systems that are implemented either third party or through an LMS. But what the courseware does, it modifies the presentation of that content to each student in response to that individual's performance. So you can see that all 3 of our students kind of had a starting point, but maybe a pre-test occurred here. And we saw student A didn't do as well. So they might not have a strong background or knowledge on this content area. So it kind of moves them down, and it creates kind of supplemental content to make sure that they have a strong foundation in the beginning content before they advance on. Where you see some, student C may have had, B and C have had background knowledge, and they actually were able to progress a little bit faster than student A. But you can see later in the semester is where they might have needed some additional support. And how this is done, the adaptive systems are capturing kind of these fine-grained data that uses feedback loops, and that's what helps inform the system to create that personalized learning pathway for each student. So how this works, students can answer initial questions of assessments. You can generate additional questions or exercises and activities, just to further their mastery of material. We'll get into a little bit about formative and summative assessments, but it works similar to that using those methods. But the nice thing is students can track their own learning and really engage in the progress through the customized learning dashboard that's available to the students, as opposed to the dashboards that are available to the faculty members. So if we go to the next slide here, we have our original definition of active learning, which is a form of learning in which teaching strives to involve students in the learning process more directly than other methods. And that's kind of exactly what adaptive courseware does. And it can do so through various activities of active learning. I think Sarah's going to share some of those on the next slide here.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. So why is active learning important? Well, it's going to reinforce certain concepts, skills, and important material that you want your students to know and be able to retain. And it's also going to further develop skills such as the ones that are listed on this slide by engaging your students in higher order thinking. And you're going to see some examples of active learning on the next slide, if we could pop over there. So here are some of the more common active learning activities that we work with faculty on. There we go. And most likely as instructional designers and technologists, you're probably familiar with most of these. So in our role, it's our job to help faculty think about what their learning outcomes are, and then choose activities like these that are going to best help students to meet those outcomes. And it's a good idea to recommend that faculty make the connection for their students between whatever learning activities they choose and your unit and course level objectives, so students can see the relationship between what they're doing or what they're learning and how it fits into that overall big picture of the course. So we're going to take a deeper dive into this a bit later when we talk about backwards design.
Thanks, Sarah. Sorry about that switch there of the slides. So as you work with faculty, this is a nice graphic that helps visualize where adaptive technology can be integrated within the course. So while adaptive tech can help meet objectives related to the lower order of Bloom's taxonomy, it's also capable of being able to meet objectives related to higher order skills. So there are different types of adaptive technologies, as well as different methods and reasons to consider when designing a course that can help determine when and how you choose to implement this technology. And we'll get to how to address those choices in a bit. So while many of you are familiar with the learning process, you can see here that the adaptive technology can be used as both a way to help acquire information as well as be a form of assessment. So typically we see adaptive technology used more as a formative assessment tool, since many types of adaptive technology can indicate to both the instructor and the student what skills and concepts may need remediation, as well as what has been mastered. So this allows for more opportunities for active learning and student engagement if it's done before class. And so it often encourages that flipped classroom model. But we've also seen it done in class, where faculty have actually provided opportunities almost like a lab for students to work together to complete the exercises within the adaptive courseware. And then it's also been done as a reinforcement after class. So there's no, silver bullet to this, but just recognizing as instructional designers, it's important to be a thought partner with our faculty to think through where do we want to place this experience structurally inside of the course. And that leads to this concept of alignment. So we've identified as a best practice through our pilot of this initiative is that most success is seen when adaptive activities and content align with what's occurring in the classroom. So for example, if in the adaptive you're on objective 3, but in the class that week you're on objective 4, it's going to be enough of a disconnect to cause confusion. So even schedule-wise, aligning that is important, but also the content itself and how it's being presented is important to be aligned with what you're saying in the course and also what's happening in the adaptive, which requires faculty to get to know the adaptive content very, very well. And then at times need support on that. And we're going to talk about how can we as instructional designers support that knowledge and knowing and deep understanding.
So many of our faculty at Cuyahoga Community College use the adaptive courseware as a type of formative assessment. And this again is a great use for the adaptive technology. One element that some types of adaptive technology include is a confidence indicator, where students indicate how confident they are with regards to their answers. And with that being said, there's different types of adaptive technology, such as machine-based learning. Some coursewares use algorithms, some were rules-based, others utilized a decision tree type setup, but they're all based around finding ways to help students identify and remediate areas where some type of lack of understanding exists before they get to the summative assessment piece in the course.
Okay, so when we started to work on this project with our faculty, I believe that we had 18 gateway courses that we identified faculty who are interested in pursuing this type of courseware for their course, and they had zero experience. So some of the questions that I think 3 key decisions that we've identified was working with faculty, how do we align a student's adaptive learning experience with the course content? So it varied by discipline and it varied by courseware, but what we were looking for is adaptive courseware ranges from a whole class delivery system to specific sections. The instructor has the control of what type of material they want to use from a particular courseware. So it was our goal to help them align their outcomes and objectives to the activities that they were selecting for their course. The second point there was, how do we use the learning analytics data to actually inform our teaching? And a little bit later in this presentation, we'll show an example of what a faculty dashboard might look like and how you can use those data points to help inform your learning. But we can use that to inform our instruction. It could prompt a faculty member to maybe create more formative assessments or create supplemental materials or share them depending on specific content areas. And then lastly, how can we effectively onboard students to direct their own learning? So when we're dealing with multiple adaptive courseware technologies, they all differ. So we had to make sure that the students knew how to effectively look at their dashboards to kind of gauge where they are in the class. And then part of that was making sure that the students had a real understanding of how that courseware was running. And it just makes the whole process easier for everybody in the class. And we'll dive a little bit deeper into these in a little bit later in the presentation, but let's see if we have any questions at this point.
Feel free to unmute your mic or put a question in the chat. We wanted to pause and open it up for a moment.
So just to be clear, this session is really talking about using adaptive courseware that's already out there, that's provided by a publisher or a third-party provider. It's not about a do-it-yourself, roll your own project. that correct?
Yeah, it's about yes and no. We are certainly, it depends. The session is about taking the backwards design planning framework and coming up with a process of how you would infiltrate either a pre-existing adaptive courseware or to build out your own. And we'll talk in which takes quite a bit of support from the vendor themselves to actually build the questions and build the content inside of their courseware. So we are talking about the courseware itself and where to place that in and how to talk about setting it up in an existing course, right? And using this as a technology tool that enhances the course content. Does that make sense, Corey?
Yeah, it sure does. Thanks a lot. And I really like the emphasis on using analytics to close the feedback loop. I think that's going to be more and more important, and also a lot easier to get to as more and more of us move to a cloud model. Thanks.
Absolutely. Great question. All right.
Okay, so where we met with each instructor, this concept's probably familiar to most people in this room that we're, it's predominantly instructional designers, but working with faculty, we wanted to make sure that when we chose the appropriate courseware that they felt fit their discipline, we really wanted to make sure that we covered all of our bases. So we implemented the process of backward design, and if you're not familiar with it, it's a process that we start with the end in mind. So it's we're looking for an effective blend of content and performance, and we can do this by placing our learning outcomes or objectives on the forefront of the planning process when we're trying to develop our course. Instructors can then create assessments, strategies that foster the learning and provides ample opportunities to measure their student learning. So, once we have identified these outcomes and objectives, the next step of the backward design process is to determine acceptable evidence. So what measurable way are we going to assess our students that they are meeting or achieving these outcomes? And then after you've determined those types of assessments, what type of learning experiences are going to prepare the students? And that's kind of where you work through the adaptive courseware and kind of lay out your course. We found that instructors, found that if they put a lot of thought into the design of their course and they developed well-crafted activities that clearly aligned with their outcomes, it really fosters students to perform on their own, and they make that connection and promote student success. So when students see and understand the outcomes of a course, it really helps with their progress in the course and hopefully aligning to meet those outcomes.
Great. And we wanted to give an opportunity to hear from participants about what processes do you use when developing a course? And then backwards design is one, and curious if there are others. And so we just encourage you to place that in the chat as we move forward with our presentation. So our backwards design workbook is sort of the basis for this webinar, and we're going to share the link for you to download this. And this is a great workbook to have inside of an initial consultation that you would have, or as a real planning framework to come back to. And it can be digitally populated. You can also print it out, depending on the context for which you would be working with a faculty member. It could also be worked inside of a workshop or an institute for orienting faculty to the backward design process itself, but also thinking through how do we place the adaptive courseware into that. So it includes the 3 steps that Kevin presented and a set of guiding questions and a place to answer those questions inside of the workbook. So the first step is identifying desired results. So what should learners hear, read, view, explore, or otherwise encounter? And you would have the faculty list that. And what skills will learners master? And what are the big ideas and important understandings participants or students should retain? And I often ask faculty, what are the essential questions, both of the course and maybe of this particular module. So going at kind of the course level and actually at the module level is a great way to cognitively signal to students where you're wanting them to get to, but also signaling to them their own thinking process to get to the mastery of learning that concept. So here's what sort of a screenshot of what it would look like inside of the workbook for step one.
The next step in the workbook would be step 2 of the backward design process, where we're determining what acceptable evidence is showing us that the students are meeting these outcomes and objectives. So some guiding questions that we use throughout the workbook that you can use with faculty is, how will I know if students have achieved the desired results within the adaptive courseware? And what will you accept as evidence of understanding and proficiency in the adaptive experience? So again, we're reiterating, you want to use measurable outcomes that align these activities or these assessments to your outcomes. Some institutions provide outcomes and objectives for faculty members, but if you find yourself writing your own, you want to make sure that they're the SMART goals, that they're specific, they're measurable, you're using action verbs that you can actually measure. We also another guiding question is, how will I know if students have achieved the desired results for the entire lesson or course? And what will I accept as evidence of understanding and proficiency in non-adaptive portions of the course? And that's really, dives down to the specifics of, how the adaptive courseware is implemented. But pretty much the question is, what assessments are needed to provide evidence that your students or a faculty member's students are understanding the material? This includes assessments both inside and outside of the adaptive courseware. And, Sarah will talk about some of the learning experiences in step 3. And there's a screenshot of what this page of the workbook looks like. And it's so nice because it's so sequential and goes step by step. So if you or a faculty member are new to the concept of backward design, it really guides you through the process.
All right, and on to step 3, design your learning experiences. So once your subject matter expert has identified their desired results and they've examined the assessments in the adaptive courseware, the next and probably the most crucial step is to determine what knowledge and skills the students need to know, and then what activities can you design where students can practice in order to achieve these knowledge and skills. So if we go to the next slide, here is a screenshot of step 3 in the workbook. And I believe this is editable. So once you get your copy, you should be able to type type in there as you're working through this with your subject matter expert. And it's at this point that you kind of want to take a good look at where and when the adaptive experience is placed in the course. Consider what type of adaptive experience, if your faculty member wants students to have, and let that kind of inform what the course activities need to be. So in the next slide, we're going to get into the concept of course mapping. And I think most of us are probably familiar with these types of diagrams. A typical course mapping activity includes a chart like this. And as part of this, when you get to the columns for the activities and assessments, this is when you need to start thinking through, or you need to think through with your subject matter expert, what is the adaptive technology going to be used for? And on the next slide, so one way to approach this is to, when you think about the purposes of the adaptive courseware, does the instructor want the courseware to introduce? Do they want it to reinforce, assess, or provide students feedback on their learning? Or is it going to be some combination of these things? And depending on the courseware, after you've taken a thorough examination of the courseware and the course modality, that might come into play a little bit. You might have a combination of all of those. So once you have the purpose of the adaptive courseware in mind, then you and the instructor need to discuss where is it going to be placed in the structure of the course. So you're both going to take a closer look at the module level of the course and determine where that adaptive experience is going to fit. If it's introducing content, it's most likely going to be before class. If it's giving students feedback, usually going to be after class, and so on and so forth.
Sarah, can I jump in here? So
Absolutely.
Working with faculty, I think this course mapping, or we call it like creating alignment maps. You know, I explain this to a faculty member who might be teaching a new prep or a new courseware or something like that. And essentially they're creating like a storyboard, like you would for a movie, but for their course. So, you know, my best practice that I recommend is that they identify all their outcomes and start with those. And I print them out even for my own courses, and I pencil in, you know, ideas for activities, assessments, resources that I might have. And when it comes time to build the course, you have everything in front of you, and it really helps the build time. So you're just pretty much plotting everything that you've already mapped out. It's also good if you teach courses that share counterparts or adjuncts, that you can hand over these course maps or alignment maps to have them make the connection between your outcomes and your assessments and what type of activities you're doing so and why. So if it's someone new teaching the class, we find that really helpful.
Great. So since our numbers are at about 40, we're going to take this first breakout session and keep it as a larger group discussion. And then we're going to present some more information to you, and then give you an opportunity to meet with your colleagues on this session for some case studies and some workshopping to work through practicing how you might address some of those cases that we've found have arisen. But in this initial piece, we'd like to ask you the question and invite you to take off the mute of your mic and tell us what questions you could imagine might arise from your faculty when asked to consider adaptive courseware in their course. And then how might you address those questions?
Hi, this is Brianna Wright. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi, I'm actually not an instructor, but I'm very interested in instructional design. And one of the things that pops out in my mind, putting myself in the shoes of a faculty member, would be, what about technical support with using adaptive courseware?
Yeah.
And training on how to use it.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, the technology piece, it's always like, oh, it's a new technology, or yet again, another technology I have to learn, is what I've heard that I can imagine Brianna faculty saying. And that's what, Kevin, you're going to.
No, that's fine. And, you know, we had these same questions. So, you know, Sarah, if you want to jump into, you know, like I said, this project started with, I think, 18 sections of courses, of gateway courses, from maths to biologies to sociologies and psychologies. So we had a wide range, and each discipline kind of went their own way of selecting a different courseware. So we were really worked closely with them on the onboarding process. We're going to share some other resources later of work guides that you can use, which will help answer a lot of these questions once you look at it. But we worked very closely with the vendor. We were very honest with our questions and our direction. You know, we had focuses on accessibility, and we didn't want this to be another concern for the faculty member. So there was a lot of demos. They gave early access to the instructor and the designers to test out a lesson. So the faculty really understood what they were getting into before they made the commitment. Sarah, am I leaving anything out there?
Just to speak a little bit to the technical support piece, that was one of the questions in our meetings with the vendors. We did ask, if this doesn't work, who do we call? And more often than not, because it is their platform, it is their courseware, they would have a technical support email or a chat on their website that instructors and students could reach out to. One thing that we learned during our process was to involve our online learning department, because there were often integrations that needed to be set up, that if those didn't work properly, then the issue was going to be an in-house one. But as far as tech support for the students and faculty, after we got those integrations set up, more often than not, the vendors took care of that.
We've also seen an integration of the tutoring center at Houston Community College. They brought the tutors in to support the students actually understanding the content, but they also had the technology knowledge, right? So if there were hiccups and things that came up and students went to the tutoring center, there were tutors there that knew about the adapted courseware or had gone through it themselves. So that added extra support was super helpful. We're also going to talk about onboarding students, which has that technical component for helping students, but also obviously would be helpful for faculty as well. And D. Mullins, I see you in the chat that you've addressed it by going through a training with faculty and TAs so they know how it works. And that TA comment made me think about the tutoring pilot that they did at Houston. And then how to find students' outcome data, grading, auto grade hand. The grading piece was interesting that we found that a lot of the integration into the LMS would include the grading, not necessarily the content. So the integration would happen to help students sort of check through how they were doing, but they would click out of the LMS to be inside of the adaptive courseware, but their grades would show up in the LMS. And we'll talk about that too, is do we integrate this with the LMS or not? And the pros and cons of that. Any other thoughts or questions that you might imagine you would be fielding from faculty?
I'll talk for 2 seconds. We've had quite a bit of faculty adopting courseware because of COVID and in spite of COVID and all of those things. But we've found that we've had as many problems and faculty are more concerned about the support or the accessibility from the bookstore perspective. So students are buying the courseware packages that are designated for the courses, but having technical difficulties. So the faculty just know that they've integrated into the course correctly, but the student is not logging in through the LMS correctly or into the platform correctly. So the bookstore is fielding a lot of questions, and we're working on that problem right now at Zane State so that we might be able to facilitate a smoother transition, a smoother acquisition, I guess is a better word, for students. I don't know whether anybody else is having that problem, but seems to be prevalent among, and it's not just one vendor. We have multiple vendors and they're all experiencing the same thing.
You know what that gets at is that happened to me at Portland State University where I used to work, where all of a sudden here I am an instructional designer. I've designed this great onboarding with the faculty, but I didn't think to talk to the bookstore, right? Like that sort of step exactly was kind of a gotcha moment of realizing the bookstore's explanation when a student walks in there was not the alignment to what we were saying in the syllabus or in the course itself.
Yeah, we did have, I do recall having one bookstore issue, and it was just the materials or access codes because we implemented this day one policies. But what we did when we worked with faculty, over the course of this project, several semesters, we formed a multidisciplinary faculty learning community, and that we met each month, where all the faculty involved would share their experiences, but each month would have a particular theme. And some of the feedback we got was a few bookstore issues that arose from the beginning of the project. So we decided to make our next FLC, our faculty learning community session, revolving around bookstore and student materials. And we actually invited individuals from the campus bookstores so they can hear the faculty feedback. And we never had a problem since then. So it was just the hiccups of the new process. We got everybody in the room in an hour and a half and they nailed it out. And I think that was the last time I heard of any issues regarding the bookstore implementation. And FLCs were a big advantage. Let me just throw that out there too. So like I said, we met monthly. It just kept everyone on the same page. It kept everyone fresh. We were identifying issues, before they would happen in other courses. So it worked out very seamless. And, as I mentioned, when we were starting this project, I knew of adaptive courseware, but I've never implemented it or used it myself. So we ended up learning a lot just from those experiences and diving into the courses and across different vendors as well. So anytime that you have the opportunity, I know COVID's kind of makes things difficult with, online stuff. But, if we get back to normal here soon, I would highly recommend, faculty learning communities revolving around this, if this is what you're going to explore.
Great point, Kevin. All right. So now we want to talk a little bit about, I know many of you have had questions about this already, is leveraging learning analytics to inform teaching. And the question, or the essential question that comes up here, is how might you guide your faculty to use learning analytics to inform their teaching? And I believe Corey mentioned earlier, like, wow, this is an opportunity to have those learning analytics at your fingertips. And that is very true. The adaptive courseware is known for that, some better than others. But we wanted to give you a little orientation into what might be some typical data points that you might see in a dashboard. And of course, we've also know that there's data points inside of a learning management system, and there's ways to orient around what those might be, including clicks on the syllabus or clicks, time on task pieces. The adaptive courseware has similar, but even more granular data points that you might see, which would be topic mastery completion. So typically an adaptive courseware is set up modularly, where there's objectives that are fulfilled by students completing a certain set of activities. And then they get to mastery of that with inside of a set of objectives. And then that leads to a dashboard informing you that they, X percentage of students have mastered this particular content. And if that's pretty low and you're able to analyze that, for example, the night before a lecture or a course, you might be able to pivot an emphasis of what your lecture would be or what the activities might be. Again, that takes a lot, right? But so knowing the dashboard and being able to monitor it over time is a great asset. And it takes practice. It's not necessarily going to happen in the first iteration of it. But orienting your faculty to the dashboard, helping them know that that's even there and how they might use it. I often do it in an inquiry-based way. I say, how would you use this data if you had it? And they might be like, I don't know, right? So that creates trust and a collaborative nature in your consultation, is kind of asking that question. Almost all the dashboards give topics struggled with. So there's a quick, often even like a red flag lifted up inside of the dashboard so that you can really hone in on what's being struggled with. Another data point is time on task. So if a certain student or group of students is taking a lot of time to get something done, you might want to ask a question. And they even have automatic emails that can be sent out, inviting them to office hours or going to the tutoring center, depending on the level, if it's 150 students versus 40, the level of intervention and capacity is going to be determined there. And then there's an overarching knowledge state set of data points. So a pre-knowledge check. So before you start things, where you're at, periodic knowledge checks, and then a post-knowledge check is a great way to look at progression over time. And that's the one that the students get to see the most, right? So they actually get these dashboards themselves. And so we're going to talk about this in the onboarding, but when they know that they have this data for them to be in charge of their learning, or what we like to say is giving them agency, that's a pretty powerful tool. And showing them that in class as well can also give them the tools they need to take charge of this experience together. And then one of the most interesting ones that was the most challenging for me at first was the confidence level. So as a student, they answer a question, but then they're asked a second question of how confident are you in your answer? And that's really interesting. Now, of course, students can game that, their own personal perceptions of that. But if you can see that their confidence level is pretty low, but they're getting it right, that's kind of an interesting data point to talk with them about. Or the reverse of it. I'm not feeling confident at all. But I'm not getting it right, right? So there can be some interventions that can happen in that way as well.
So this is a dashboard, a sample dashboard from a Pearson product that one of our faculty recently used. And Pearson uses what are called dynamic study modules as their adaptive learning experiences. And in this grade center, those dynamic study modules are indicated by the orange columns in this grade book. So the instructor uses them as formative assessments. They're given a point for completing them. The red are students who didn't follow through and complete the entire adaptive experience in the module. And to some of what Susan mentioned, there are little tabs at the top where not only can the instructor get a view of did they complete this adaptive experience or not, but they can click on another tab and take a look at the amount of time a student spent on the dynamic study modules. They can take a look at the difficulty. They can take a look at early alerts. that are sent out to students who struggle. So the data instructors have access to on the back end varies a little bit depending on which courseware vendor is used. So this isn't representative of all adaptive dashboards, but really kind of gives you a good idea of what kind of information instructors have access to that can potentially be used to inform their teaching going forward.
And so in leveraging the learning analytics, this is a screenshot of kind of getting us back to that workbook that we're going to share at the end. So this is, again, a tool for you to be able to hand to your faculty, but also have in front of you to help ask those questions and kind of guide your consultation with them. And this also gets to when do you use these data points? So again, in that conversation, when you're asking, how would you use this data if you had it, is helping them think through, well, preparing for in-class time is a great way to then look at the data and say, okay, class level mastery, topic struggled with, overall student confidence is going to be helpful to prepare for the class. But then those interventions, working with individuals, you might look at time on task, individual mastery level, individual topics struggled with, and confidence level as well, are the two sort of areas we would imagine utilizing these data points. And actually, because we didn't go into the breakout room, I'm going to pause here to see if there's any questions about learning analytics data before we move on to student onboarding. All right, we're happy to move on, and I'm sure there'll be questions at the end as well.
Okay, so when we were working with faculty and onboarding them to the project and to the adaptive courseware, one thing that we noticed was that the question we kept getting, well, how are the students going to know this? Or how are the students going to, where are they going to click? So, it became evident, like, our aha moment was like, well, we should probably, have an onboarding for the students as well to make sure that everyone's on the same page. And it worked great. So some of the things that students need to understand, some of these are kind of repeated from the data points slide a few slides ago, but you want to explain to them what adaptive courseware is. They have no idea, just as much as, they knew as much as we did at the time. But, you want to explain to them that kind of highlights what they know and, brings them back to concepts that they still might need some clarification about, but it really puts them in the driver's seat for their own learning. Their performance, they can get through things very quickly, or they might need to spend some time to kind of retain or to get the knowledge to move forward. Their personalized dashboard allows them to track all of their progress and where they need to get to be mastery of a specific topic. So introducing them to the dashboard and how to read that was important. There was a few ways that we approached this. For our faculty who were teaching face-to-face classes, the first day of class, some of them did a demonstration, walking them through the adaptive courseware, explaining what it was. I think even one of our publishers shared a short video to play for their students in the class. And then we had some, our online sections where they didn't have the capability of, having a class face-to-face. They created a sample assignment and using the courseware where it was low stakes, just a little formative assignment to walk the students through what an assignment might look like, how they log in. Most of our adaptive courseware was just single sign-on. So they logged into our LMS, they would click the link and it would automatically launch the courseware. But, and we'll get into a few more examples of what we did here, I think, on the next slide, but I'll pass this to Sarah to wrap this slide up with the data.
Yeah, just a quick word about letting your students know about the data that you're going to be collecting on them. Onboarding is a great opportunity to inform them how and why you're going to be using their data. And it's important that students understand that, so they take the adaptive learning experiences seriously, so they are guided through the learning experience and the course in a meaningful way that is eventually going to result in their success in the course.
Yeah, and I think I mentioned a few of these on the, we can jump to the next slide here. I jumped ahead a little bit, but some things that we incorporated into our classes that made the onboarding of students much easier, where we helped craft a syllabus statement, and there are examples in the workbook that will be shared after this. Just explaining what adaptive courseware is and how it's going to be used in the class. I mentioned that some individuals did in-class explanations or online videos to share within their sites. You could use class time or to complete a sample activity using the courseware. There's video orientations from some vendors, but we found it really helpful when students understood the reasoning behind the technology. And some instructors even shared feedback where they showed, the faculty members showed the students their dashboard and how they would be using data points to inform their instruction too. And it just bringing everything full circle. It was full disclosure. And I think that it really gave ownership to the students, that they could see exactly where they're struggling. And it helped them ask questions of the faculty member as well. They could pull up their dashboard and said, hey, I'm struggling here. And it creates that more personalized approach between that student and that faculty member for that specific content area.
One little anecdote to that is when a faculty member that I spoke to got up in front of class and said, I've noticed that 75% of you struggled with this topic, and therefore I'm going to add this activity, or I would like to open it up to questions, that students actually were like, I actually didn't do the homework. I'm not part of that data point. I need to do the homework. Like there was just that sort of like, oh, this does matter. This is actually working and informing and enhancing and shifting the way this class works, how I'm performing. And that's an important point, right? So even if it's not as necessary or not thinking of it, like doing that in the class is really a powerful moment for students to feel like they're part of the learning.
Yeah, and that was a lot of the feedback that we got from faculty as well. It's just nice. And I think someone mentioned earlier in one of the share outs about, they're looking at this courseware and stuff because of COVID, et cetera. And our psychology department, this was piloted by a full-time faculty at the East Campus. And she had, we have 4 campuses, and one of our campuses, she had so much success where she decided to make this college-wide implementation of this adaptive courseware. And then, all the adjuncts were onboarded, quickly, and they were semester after semester. And then when COVID hit, they had 0 hiccups. They just kept running because everything was online. Students knew what to do. And it was actually, a big success that helped them through that moments of 2020 without, any setbacks to the students or the faculty's progress.
Great.
And this was just, working through the workbook. We just wanted to share some more screenshots of what this section of the workbook looks like for examples to onboard students.
Great. So here's what we get to have a little bit of fun, where we want to give you an opportunity to take this content, take these ideas, and apply them to your context, and apply them to what might be happening and what you might be managing for. So we're going to give you an option to bring your own sort of issue or question to your small breakout room, or pick one of these 3 scenarios that we want to offer you in what might happen in a consultation. So one being a math department or psychology department coming up with a common master course using adaptive courseware. Consider how you would approach consulting with that faculty. What would be your role, and what might be some things that would come up? The other scenarios, faculty wants to replace their textbook with adaptive courseware and wants to highly customize it, right? So what might come up there? How might you guide them through that? Maybe even working with the vendor and being a liaison there. And then the last is biochemistry faculty wants to use adaptive courseware to reinforce skills. So they decide to set it up as a formative activity weighted at 5% of the overall course grade, essentially a set it and forget it approach, which we've seen a lot. How would you approach that? We have seen that a higher percentage rate is going to show more success, but how would you mitigate that or work with a faculty in that particular scenario? So we want to give you a chance to work on your own or work on any one of these scenarios. And I believe Eric, I'm going to check the chat. We do have a collaborative note-taking doc, but we have the questions here in the chat, but also a note-taking.
Able to negotiate. were actually able to negotiate the prices of their courseware down to a fraction of what a textbook would. I think our psychology course went from $180 for the textbook down to about $50 for the entire semester of first day access adaptive courseware. And it had everything that they were looking for. And then the faculty members were able to add any additional content that they've created to the course as well. So.
Yeah, that's important. That accessibility piece is a big question and important to think through and make sure the vendor has that as an option.
Yeah, and come out and ask them, directly, how accessible is your content? Is there a VPAT, et cetera? Make sure, I would lean towards a courseware that is accessible for your students. It will make your work a lot easier in the long run.
Genzeb, I see your hand up, and also John. How about John? We'll start with you.
One of my questions was, I did wonder about passing on the cost to students. That was helpful and how you figured that through. But where do you find what you're looking for? Let's say you have a psychology class, biology class that wants to use it. How do you go about the process of seeing what's out there so you can compare things? Okay, go.
Sorry, I didn't know who was grabbing it.
I was like, I was definitely thrown into both you and Sarah. You guys are at the
Okay.
front lines right
So,
now.
Sarah, do you want to the website that you use to kind of guide the development of the book?
So I'm having a moment right now, and I can't remember the name of the website. So maybe Susan, can you refresh my memory?
Yeah, it's the vendor index, right? It's the index. So let me pull that up.
Yeah. So Susan, if you can place that link into the chat. Yeah, there was a vendor index that we used. We had a group that went to an ATD conference when we were first starting this grant, and they got a ton of resources that they brought back to us. And one of them was this website. And on this site, you can kind of filter through what is your content area, and it'll bring up the coursewares that are out there for your content area. What is your LMS? And kind of go from there, looking through the individual vendors. And from there, our faculty kind of identified a handful that they wanted to look at a little bit further. And we, as instructional designers and technologists, kind of served as a point people to arrange visits, whether they were virtual and in person, from these vendors, where they could present their products and we could all ask questions. But this website was kind of our starting point. And the name of it is really escaping me right now.
I know. Tool selection here. Yeah.
I knew that was going to come up too.
Yep. So I'm going to put this in the chat. And this is a resource on that the network that we work with, the Every Learner Everywhere network, has a whole tool selection asset and a workbook to go through with that. And I thought they had the link to that actual product index. And so I'm looking through it there. Hopefully I can find it before we end today. And it should be in there. So yeah, it can be a team effort. And it's also a funny one as institutions and even organizations like ourselves. It's a little bit of an edge, John, for us to endorse one or the other, right? So we have to guide faculty and institutions to try it and then use their own network to kind of share what works and what doesn't work, and what they like best. And so that's what we're trying to create, is these opportunities for you to be in faculty learning communities and to be in communities of practice to do just that.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Yeah.
It was edsurge.com.
That's what it was.
That's what we initially stumbled upon, and we used that.
That's it.
Yeah.
I was thinking edX, like I couldn't get that out of my head. And we can share that link too.
I'm looking for it. Let's move on to, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. Maybe you could let us know. Your hand was up.
Genzeb?
Genzeb, okay,
That's
great.
correct, yeah.
All right.
Now, I came late to the group 6. So I was looking at the question, and then there is a courseware which has to be released in an adaptive way. So I'm thinking the students have to click something to go to the next section. So in a course, if you set up like that, that by itself, the activity by itself is a requirement. And sense of being tagged as formative, for me, it's mischieving, because you can say for at the end of this module, take these 2 questions, and then when you are done with these 2 questions, you can move to the next module. That could be the setup. And the questions can be marked, but in this case, if they are formative, then they should not be part of the final grade. I mean, they can be graded, but they should not be like summative. So if they are formative, then they have to be maybe extra or bonus. Still, this, a grade item can be captured in the grade center, but they have to be tagged as bonus or extra, because basically they are the requirement to move to the next step. And then the student has to do it again and again. If they are X, maybe they have to score the 2 questions to move. If they are doing it again and again, that is formative, but it's a requirement to move into the next step. And then for me, tagging them as formative with a score in the grade center is not a right thing. That's what I feel.
And are you feeling locked into that with the courseware, that they don't allow you to choose to keep it as formative? Is that what I'm hearing your question?
Yes, it's not in the sense that an activity designed to reinforce what is going to be assessed or what has to be learned. It is an activity which is used to release the next topic. So if it is adaptive for me, so that is a requirement. Formative usually are to reinforce, as my colleagues have put it there, to reinforce what's going to be learned, what's going to be assessed. So having it as get it or set it, basically it's like pass or fail. And then if you don't make it, what's going to happen? They cannot go to the next module.
Right.
Or
yeah, the nature of the adaptive courseware inside of it, and interrupt me if I'm not answering your question or really the comment it sounds like you're also potentially making here, is in the context of the adaptive courseware, it's all formative because they are completing a question, and depending on its answer, they're going to go into a different pathway until they get to mastery. Once they're in mastery, then they're going to be able to go to the next level or the next objective, right? And so one way faculty can keep it formative throughout, even if it's, getting to the next mastery level, is to use the whole adaptive courseware as a formative exercise activity, that you're moving from one thing to the other, but that the summative becomes something else, not in the adaptive, inside of the course, would be one way to do it. And I do believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, Kevin and Sarah, there is a way potentially, and I haven't worked with all of them, to turn that off, to allow them to jump to a whole nother topic, even if they haven't mastered the first one. Like you can shift it from progression to bumping around, but some probably don't, because they recognize that cognitively there's a pathway to mastery that has to be adhered to, is my guess.
okay.
Yeah, I can't remember exactly what the feature was called, but yeah, they could skip ahead, but like to a different unit, but it also like informed the instructor of that action too. But not all of them do that.
Yeah, I think it's my perception. So if they don't do it, if it is a requirement, and then if they cannot jump, then that's what I was thinking. Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. And we also try to amplify and provide opportunities for you as a faculty member to give feedback to the vendor, right? So when you find an instance where, wow, this is a barrier to my students, right, and the learning isn't happening based on your assumption that they need to progress in a certain way, allowing for that flexibility for you to go back and shift that is an important, to me, agency that you should have as a faculty member. But it also requires you and us as your support team to understand the rationale for the vendor designing it that way, which may have some research-based pedagogy, right, for that progression to happen the way it is in their system. Great question, though. Any other learnings, thoughts, comments, or questions? These have been great ones for us.
I have a kind of a question, comment, or comment as we're looking in group 6. I think one of our biggest concerns was it was kind of listed as a set it and forget it approach. And so that was a concern for us to maybe talk to the faculty and find out, you know, if the courseware is actually, if you're actually looking at the data from the courseware, if you're actually getting feedback, are the students actually reinforcing the skills? Are there any gaps in the material that is presented within the courseware? And if there's something else that may need to be added. So that was probably our biggest concern, was the kind of set it and forget it. Not whether it's part of the grade or not. I mean, we understand that it's important to reinforce skills, and we know that it's good, you know, to have a graded opportunity for students because they may not do it otherwise. But doing it without actually going back to look at the data and whether students were gaining anything from it was kind of a red flag.
Yeah, has anybody else experienced that and found solutions to that, you know, turn it on and forget about it approach that your faculty have done?
Something a little, you know, somewhat related to that. I know that when we were working with faculty, you know, closely with this, that one of the FLCs, the learning communities, they mentioned how the courseware and the students have in their own dashboard actually, as a result of that, increase the number of interactions that the faculty had with the student. The students were actually coming with more questions based off of their dashboard. So they were seeing how they were being assessed in areas where they might need to improve. And they were actually coming or asking questions in class and meeting the instructor in office hours or before and after class regarding those. And the faculty members attribute that to the dashboard. So even if the faculty member did, you know, set it and forget it, the students were still, you know, driving some of that interaction as well.
Yeah, that's great. And Corey put into the chat that they suggested comparing the data from the formative practice sets to the first exam. You know, and that kind of gets to the comment we had earlier around how does this formative versus summative work? And how powerful would it be, Corey, to have the faculty show the students that analysis, like teach them how to actually do that analysis themselves, because they have the formative data for themselves and they also have their exam score, and help them make meaning of that. That also can help with motivation and moving them to progress to see, oh, where could I be different in the second exam, or how could I be?
I just have a general question. This is Kay, and does the length of the course, like either 8 weeks or 16 weeks, does it have any impact on whether or not you should do adaptive release?
Actually, you know, that's a good question. I haven't had that question before, but knowing how adaptive works, Kay, that there is a lot of settings. So you could have them do just one module, just 2 modules, and then, you know, something else for that content. And students can move as fast or as slow as they need to in the courseware. And I think almost all of them, you can set how many questions per objective or how many activities per objective would be deployed in any given module. So you can make it shorter as well, to match that sort of time frame that you would have a constraint around.
Thank you.
Any other questions, comments, or learnings? These have been great. All right. Well, if there are no other questions, I'm actually going to give you time back. We're going to give you time back. And we want to share a couple of resources. If we could share the workbook in the chat again, and then Eric, I would love you to bring up the adapt slide that we want to let you all know if you're interested in knowing even more. This has just been a taste. We are going to be offering on December 1st, on Wednesday, December 1st, coming right up after Thanksgiving break, a full day conference. Essentially, it's a showcase where we're going to hear from all kinds of faculty and staff and lots of instructional designers on how they've done this and what's worked and what hasn't worked. And it's free of charge. And actually, you can put the link in the chat for the registration. Up. There goes Eric right there. And we have a keynote speaker, Sharon Lau, who's executive in residence at JFF, Jobs for the Future. She also is the former senior policy advisor for higher education at the U.S. Department of Education. So she's a wonderful speaker, very thoughtful. And we plan on this, like today, having it be very interactive. So you can ask questions to help support your context. What are you managing for in your world, in your arena, whether it's supporting faculty or teaching courses yourself. So it's going to be a great chance to get even more questions answered and more content to move forward. And it's not just about adaptive, it's also about digital learning in general, especially as our world with COVID has shifted so much in the education space. This is a chance to get together with your colleagues and peers to ask questions and share successes. Did I miss anything else, team? I think we might be good.
I think you're good. Yeah, we had some really good feedback during the breakouts.
So I will be sending a follow-up email. You'll get a copy of the deck. We'll also send out a PDF of these notes that you took to have as a resource for you, and also a link to the recording for today. And it takes a little bit to render and a little bit of time for me to set that email up. So you should have that by the end of the week at the latest. We look forward to seeing you again, possibly at the ADAPT event. So thank you so much for your engagement. And I want to thank all my colleagues for supporting this and bringing forward their expertise. It's been great to work with you.
Thanks, everyone.